the question I chose is cybersecurity. Is cyber risk management a good business? Not surprisingly, I'm going to argue it is, but I'm going to talk a little bit about ways that it can be better business and things, what it means for the implications of government when it's not good enough business to achieve national security outcomes. I left government about 8 weeks ago. I was the assistant director for the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, was with CISA for a number of years and its predecessor organizations, and spent the last 3 years running something called the National Risk Management Center. And our job within CISA, one of our jobs was to bring the concepts of enterprise risk management to the cybersecurity challenge and really build the processes to do a better job of treating cybersecurity as a national security risk. But in doing that, got really interested in the idea of making sure that cybersecurity was part of an overall enterprise risk governance process in corporate settings and in organizations that have enterprise risk management, enterprise risk governance. Because if you could get business owners and people who have fiduciary responsibility for organizations to take cybersecurity seriously, you were going to raise the level of cybersecurity and there would be less challenges for the government to step in to work on. And so I thought that was an important idea. As I said, I left government a couple months ago. I'm with a company called Externalities that is a third-party risk management, risk analysis company. And one thing I hope to do is continue to write and think about these ideas. And so this is my first post-government talk, and I'm going to just play with some ideas. And I've sat in this room for 3 or 4 things today, and so far every speaker somehow succeeds at going all the way up to their limit and not taking questions. I will try not to pass that, so if anyone has any thoughts or questions, I appreciate the feedback. So what does it mean? What does cyber as a risk management issue mean? First of all, grounding in risk management. It means that organizations have some level of ability to set their own risk tolerance or what level of risk they're going to accept and think through and actually have a strategic conversation about how much risk they're willing to bear. It means that you obviously have the ability to identify, assess, evaluate risk, cyber in terms of risk, which means quantifying, qualifying the risk at some level. Clearly, the most important part of risk management is taking steps to mitigate risk, which take into account your expected benefits of risk reduction and the costs as it relates to mitigation of risk, which leads to the measuring outcomes. And as we're talking about this, of course, in a business context, is how much are you spending on cybersecurity and what are you getting from a risk reduction value? And as part of risk management, that also involves having the governance processes and the structures to do that. And so that's what I would ground a general risk management process. Putting cyber into that is the aim. Again, we were trying to do that within the government. It is incredibly difficult to do it in a huge national security bureaucracy. It's probably difficult to do it in lots of different bureaucracies, including for-profit bureaucracies, but it's probably a little bit easier than across the whole national security enterprise. So the question of whether it is good business, again, I think the answer is yes. And when I say cybersecurity here, it's the kinds of things we've been talking about in the conference, the basic cybersecurity controls, multi-factor authentication, endpoint detection, privilege access management, taking care of end-of-life systems, the basics of cyber preparedness, what we've heard in a number of different discussions around planning and training and exercising and things like that. The basics of knowing your own risk, knowing your critical processes, knowing what assets you care about. Know your suppliers, the third parties that could introduce cyber risk into systems, and again, having risk governance processes in place. And so if that's the basics of what a cyber security risk management program or cyber risk management program is, I think there is increased evidence and ability to continue to gain evidence that it is good business because it achieves business metrics. The first of which is the continuity of operations, because you are not losing downtime because of systems being down because of a cyber incident of any sort, which is related, of course, to the minimizing of expected loss that you would have from a loss of operation, the value that you get by protecting sensitive information. All of these things are quantifiable in terms of business outcomes. If your business is a going concern, if it's going and cyber is not doing that, and you're not losing information, clearly that can be valued in terms of business metrics. But then there are other things that are sort of one-offs of that. changes in your insurance rates, changes in how much you can insure, how much risk you can transfer, which again is, as we're seeing as the industry moves, is quantifiable in terms of what insurance is now available to you because of you following good cyber practices in the insurance industry. Cyber insurance industry, of course, is increasingly looking for those practices, particularly in the light of the ransomware incidents, pardon me. Another aspect of what makes cybersecurity good business is customer demand, particularly if you are a supplier and you're selling into systems who are putting those requirements into contracts, and the expectation that you meet certain standards, certain certifications, and follow certain controls there to be competitive. That's good business. That there's also the aspect that you are reducing liability, you're reducing loss if something was going to happen, and you're avoiding costly oversight from the government, which is a little bit harder to quantify. But I think it's been largely proven that if you can demonstrate you have good cybersecurity practices in place, you're going to reduce sort of second-order business costs. As I said, I'm just leaving government. We were thinking with these things. I want to continue to pull the research around these areas. At this point, can find statistics that will point to it, but I think holistically having statistics around these areas to demonstrate where that is the case is important. So, in an ideal world, if these things are provable things this improves your bottom line, that would hopefully lead to all the things that I led as good cybersecurity is just being self-evidently adopted by businesses. And therefore, this problem is sort of solved. Government doesn't have much to do here, and call it a day there. Of course, that's not the world we live in right now. And I think there are some factors that, despite the argument that it's good business, cyber risk management programs and industry properly pricing and managing their own risk is not yet there. The work we were doing at CISA, some of the reasons we pointed to that were things like information imbalance, that you didn't have as much information as possible about threats or how to effectively manage vulnerabilities or things that were sort of higher risk from the system there. The second thing, of course, is that organizations didn't end up being as good at cybersecurity as they had all the intent in the world, but didn't have the capability to be as good at cybersecurity. And that's a technology improvement statement. That's a workforce statement. Those of you who just heard the ICS conversation, that there are lots of reasons that even once you make the commitment to ICS security and say you're going to do things, you can't get there. And so I think building more capacity around cybersecurity was another reason that organizations don't achieve it. That clearly relates to underinvestment in that, and so even with the argument that it's worth investing in cybersecurity, if you're underinvesting in your overall infrastructure, your overall tech funding, then you're probably not going to get there. And perhaps because of the misbalance of corporate incentives in terms of profits or other incentives, there are incentive gaps in getting to an optimal level of managing risk for your business interests. Then there are smaller organizations, particularly the smaller organizations are your third parties, which, all these things sort of crash into it, and even making a commitment doesn't seem possible. And finally, the sort of cultural view that let's take cybersecurity seriously as a risk issue, but we'll just push it back into the IT department to go do it. And there's a gap between the IT department achieving the CISA department achieving business objectives in doing that. And so those were how I came to see some of the factors that were limiting what again I would hope would be sort of an optimal increased investment in cyber to manage risk. And a lot of what I thought we were trying to do at CISA, the government agenda, is to improve information, is to stimulate more funding into the system, create incentives, invest more in underlying R&D and education and innovation, so that eventually, and I think that will bear fruit over the next 15, 20 years, if not sooner, that all the money that's been pushed into creating a culture of cybersecurity means that there are tools in greater capacity there. And then, also looking for ways to sort of pool solutions so that small businesses, medium-sized businesses who didn't have access to, bespoke cybersecurity capability could get it from other things in a more cost-effective way. And so those were, I think, gave a little bit of government's agenda to fill the gap between a commitment to manage risk you increase cybersecurity and manage risk to achieve business objectives and the ability to achieve it. But then the other argument that I think I'm going to continue to explore is even with that all in place, there's still what we came to call the national security delta, which is that organizations taking completely rational actions and effectively managing their own cyber risk may still leave risk that is of interest to a national security from a national security perspective, and that's because in certain critical infrastructure, for a variety of reasons, the risk tolerance of the government may be lower than the risk tolerance of the business itself. Some of that goes around in traditional challenges with catastrophic risk management that up to a certain point, if you get to a level of catastrophe, a business can't rationally defend against a nation state or defend against an act of God and that sort of stuff. But the government still has to be in that business of being a catastrophic risk manager. The government, obviously, from a national security perspective, has expectations to manage the cascading impacts of a cyber incident. And so Colonial as an example, right? It's not Colonial's, there's no argument that it will ever be Colonial's responsibility to manage gas prices that increase because the pipeline shut down. And right, that's again an area where, the government owns or perceives, should define the cascading risks there. And then a couple other areas where I think the government has special interests, different risk tolerances than businesses, the perception of things going wrong. There's a sort of confidence in that we are not being attacked by our adversaries and things aren't. And so treating consequential cyber incidents as just a cost of doing business is not in the government's interest. And then finally, the idea of something that happens one place can be replicable other places and could spread, which is the systemic impacts of incidents. And so it's that delta where I think I'd like to see the government either focusing on stimulating to get businesses to a higher level of risk management and providing information and capacity to help them do that and incentives where necessary, and then explicitly honoring and recognizing that there's a delta there that could be where that's where our job as a country, as a government, is to define that and make the investment to get to additional level of national security. And I think as we go forward, would like to continue to see more work at putting better metrics and analysis into defining these risks. I saw a lot of progress in my time in watching businesses have the ability to talk about cyber in terms of a risk and financial term. I think that needs to continue to improve. There needs to be more data available. We need to also have the ability to aggregate that in other sources, continue to work on sort of ownership, and that's where the policy framework really comes in, who owns the risk, and making sure that if there is risk that we as a country don't want to take on, there's some definition and understanding of who the owners are to fill the gap. And it's just not beating up on businesses to go further than makes sense from a shareholder perspective. So that's another area. And I think the continued work of sort of accountability at the corporate level and definition, you're not to blame necessarily if there's a cyber incident, but you are accountable for managing your business as a going concern, and that accountability needs to lie with the folks who manage businesses as a going concern. So I'll stop there, see if anyone's got any thoughts or feedback. Want to keep working on that stuff. Yeah.
So, ultimately, CRI, I'm curious, I mean, you said, what was it, about 8 weeks since you left? A lot of the work that has been done in the past 2 years has also been met with robust investment, national attention from the Hill, attention from the White House. I guess as we look forward, right, how confident are you, now that you can kind of speak a little more freely about, as the winds shift, and something else becomes, the issues of the day in terms of national security, how some of these risk programs, some of this infrastructure, foundation that you feel like has been created, will in fact sustain in a way that can support that kind of relationship with business?
Yes. So I didn't talk, first of all, let me take a brief set aside. I didn't really talk about making cybersecurity good risk management practice for the federal government, for the federal civilian networks. And a lot of the investment that's been made in CISA, of course, is around the federal networks. And I think the government as a whole has got a whole challenge about making the government executives the accountable risk owners to improve their system. So I think in the federal network, there's a lot of work. Federal networks, there's still a lot of work. I think the EO was good to drive cybersecurity as a risk management practice within the federal government, but I think that's early on in effectively being in place. In terms of the more broad, I do think the money and the way the money is allocated versus the government stimulus into addressing this risk problem, there's a lot of risk of that not being done effectively, right? Grants are not a very effective incentive to get state loan. Just the way grants are administered, you're going to write checks, and checks are going to go to people for short term, and what's going to be achieved. And that's why I want better risk language, better risk metrics, so you can really evaluate. I think there's a will to put money in, but is there a will to put money in effectively to achieve that? Again, in the corporate side, like that's the discussion that should be driven by the C-suite and the boards, that this is actually achieving the aims, and we have a multi-year strategy to achieve the aims to buy down all this risk. I think I think the governance structures are on the journey to do that effectively. So I'm a little more optimistic that corporations will get that, and certainly well-capitalized corporations will get there quicker than the ability of enterprises that are governed a little less rationally. But you do have to reduce some shareholder pressure on costs.
As a follow-up to make it a little more plain for the time of this talk is, you talked about, I guess, C-suite interest, I think, has tracked with Hill interest, with administration interest, right? And so we have this unique opportunity in a lot of large organizations where, they're hiring CTOs, CISOs, CIOs. There's a team, if you will.
Yeah.
I guess I'm looking ahead. If we're not in this hyper tense kind of ransomware, it can happen every day environment that's being covered in fear is constant. How difficult then does it become to convince shareholders, convince boards to sustain that investment moving forward? This is kind of
I mean, it's a good question. My assumption is once you build this stuff into your P&L models and all that stuff, that you're not just going to stop doing it because ransomware is not in the news. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to dissipate from too much pressure that cyber is a strategic concern, and that our adversaries are still doing that. So I think we have running room that the structures that have been put in place in corporate governance to take this seriously aren't going to just go away because we forgot about the last cyber attack. I mean, that's the sustained process change and improvements and technical work that needs to be done to make sure that this risk is part of the enterprise risk structure.
So I think maybe piggybacking off of what Bonnie had mentioned a moment ago about investing in the executive team, the CTO, the CISO, the CIO. You had mentioned at the top of your talk that cyber risk has always been viewed as an IT problem. Do you see in your experience trends or commonalities or patterns of business stakeholders outside of the IT department wanting to take on cyber risk from an overarching ERM perspective, enterprise risk management?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I tried to get going was more engagement with chief risk officers at CISA. CISA traditionally has worked with, not wrongly, the chief information security officers and versions of that and people in the security business. And most chief risk officers I engage with are not security, but they are process people, right? They run the governance places, and then they're making decisions about where you're buying insurance, how you're balancing across your balanced scorecard of risks and all of that. And education of things like that, I think, are useful. Corporate board of directors. I heard Chris Boyer earlier talk about whether you need a cyber expert on your board. You need cyber expertise on your board. I think he was saying that doesn't necessarily have to come in some guy with a CISP or who went to the SANS training, but you need cyber expertise. And I think saw a lot of positive improvements in that. What Diane was saying just about members of Congress who can now at least maybe ask questions about cybersecurity. I mean, that's what you need at that level, right? You need people who are able to not be glazed over, to ask an educated question and follow up and have the capability to follow up. That's the wonder of what I think Bryson's trying to do here.
So I think maybe that most of the losses are externalities to the business in the sense that the businesses don't necessarily bear the cost. A lot of businesses, even ones that should be cybersecurity, have a big hack, and then they wind up making even more money on So how to price this externalities? What have you thought about that?
So I think that's right, and that's where I'd really like to see more research of how much of it is an externality versus not. Like Larry Clinton and his team just released a new book, which had some pretty good evidence that shareholder price you didn't lose stock value from a cyber loss. So cyber loss, it did not lose value. So obviously, cyber incidents that stop operations have operational costs. If how do you value your data leakages? That's a little less. I mean, insurance will value it, and you just have to pay people for breaches and things like that. But yeah, I think one of the imperatives is having better understanding of if those externalities are going to dominate how much you're willing to do in a rational business thing. There has to be, and we think those externalities are bad for overall national market efficiency and national security efficiency. Then we have to have a strategy to either price in those externalities into the business or have somebody else pay for managing that external risk, or instead of
that's what I was wondering. So like at Ohio State University where I work, it used to be true that the maintenance cost of the computers was bigger than the computers in purchasing them. And then, but actually, I believe that the cost to society of all of our intrusions was probably less bigger than that. But then we tightened up a lot, and the cost has come down quite a bit.
Yeah.
So that's good news. But anyway, we didn't tighten down for any particular reason.
I do not think that the concepts of putting economics of cyber into those terms have been effectively achieved within government yet at this point. I think people can talk like I'm talking and we can have these conversations, but actually figuring out that pricing and all that to better do this and go to a more efficient security, market to chief security isn't there. And yeah, I tried my best, but leave it for others.
Another question. You talked about sometimes there being an imbalance between a company's risk tolerance when it comes to cyber and maybe a national security risk tolerance. Have you seen any efforts to try to standardize how that risk is being measured or quantified in a way so that it may be a little bit more standardized to be able to see where those imbalances are?
Not that I've gained any real traction there. I think, I'd like to see more definition of things that are most critical so that you can, and you see this in some regulations, you can write in, if you're most critical, your risk tolerance can't be below this level, right? Maybe not all the way to what, the national security interest in, but you can't accept, Amazon Cloud should not be able to accept too much risk on behalf of their business decisions at such a point that the government and its clients then bear the results of the risk. And so, I mean, there are ways to write that further in, but work has to be defined. So,
one more question.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Have you seen examples of companies that effectively are setting a risk appetite statement, tolerance ranges? I was at Gartner before moving to Amazon and talked to a lot of different companies, and I just haven't seen, honestly, anyone that is good at that.
Mm-hmm.
Again, maybe just...
I mean, I've been told a lot of people are good at it. I haven't sat in the meetings in Denver, right? One of the limitations of what I had access to see was the actual processes there. A lot of things brief well on a PowerPoint slide when they get presented to me. But I mean, like your experience, talking to consulting firms who are clearly trying to make this argument, talking to auditors about their in price. I think, firms who can offer that service will help people get better at it, and auditors will help demand that. Yeah.